Welcome to Carnegie Politika podcast. My name is Alexander Gabuev. I'm director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin. Today, we're going to talk about Donald Trump's election as US president and its impact on war in Ukraine and Russia's foreign policy. I'm happy to be joined by my esteemed colleague, Alexander Baunov, who is editor-in-chief of Carnegie Politika, our publication platform, and senior fellow at Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you for inviting.
I think that majority of analysts who are discussing Trump's election victory, despite unexpected nature to at least some, say that this is definitely not only victory for Trump, but also victory for Moscow and Vladimir Putin. Do you agree?
Well, I would agree in several senses, but not to the same extent as it was the case 8 years ago. This magical number of 8 years. What did you do 8 years? What Moscow did do 8 years ago? This is political meme in Russian propaganda saying to all opponents of the war. So what they say, the Russian propagandists, Russian officials were doing 8 years ago. They were jubilating the victory of Donald Trump. At that time, it was totally clear that Donald Trump's victory is in Russia's interest, but it's not only about Russia's interest. It was about the perception of would be possible to achieve with this president in the White House. And the hopes were very high. The basic expectation, the main expectation was that the new big deal, the new division of the world in the bipolar style or maybe more multipolar style, while still in the spirit of the Cold War era, was possible. And you remember, of course, well, officially, Vladimir Putin at least was pretending that his stance was neutral, and the American elections, the domestic affair of the American people. But you remember, of course, how this victory was greeted, cheered by Margarita Simonyan, for instance.
There were a couple of parties that people were inviting Muscovites to. We both lived in Moscow back then, and we remember that quite vividly in the intellectual circle of pro-Kremlin bloggers, members of parliament, various well-connected business people. That was a real celebration.
It was a real fiesta in some sort of what the same Margarita Simonyan is calling Moscow saloons. The expectation didn't come true, but they didn't blame Donald Trump for this, although Donald Trump was not very mild in deeds, not in words. In words, he was expressing his understanding, like praising Vladimir Putin as a strong man. But in deeds, nothing really happened besides the chaotic rule, chaotic presidency that Moscow was happy to see. But the defeat of Donald Trump is defeat with not very convincing numbers, or at least as it was interpreted by Donald Trump himself and his Moscow supporters, his Moscow admirers, was interpreted as the cheated victory of Democrats and cheated defeat of Donald Trump and the artificial end of Russian expectations. And the idea of retaliation for this, the idea of taking our hopes for the new world order was started to grow in the Kremlin corridors. It was clear that it was at that time we could achieve some new, better for Russia world with Donald Trump as president. His presidency came to an end in a not very honest way as it was seen from Moscow. Then my impression is they felt that they have right to act different way.
And then you think that this sentiment in Moscow that 2020 presidential election in the US was rigged, that's genuine. So people in the Kremlin actually share Donald Trump's assessment. I know a couple of members of the Russian elite who told me that it's absolutely true that the establishment, the deep state, has helped to manipulate the election in order to bring Joe Biden to the White House. And they seem to be convinced. But what's your experience talking to the Russians that you know?
Well, to put it in the very beginning, the Donald Trump election is not only gains, but problems for Moscow. But of course, when choosing between those candidates of the 2022 elections, Moscow intuitively was behind Donald Trump. But without these big hopes and expectations of the last time, for several reasons. if you are talking about the supporters of the war, or maybe Vladimir Putin himself, the fear is that Donald Trump is a person who can really impose a deal that Moscow otherwise wouldn't accept. If Vladimir Putin won't be able to achieve the deal or the victory, as he puts this, on his terms, then Donald Trump can try to achieve his own victory, to stop the war, to stop the conflict, to stop the aggression on his own terms. And the Russian leadership, the Russian political leadership, basically Vladimir Putin himself, will have a difficult choice to accept or not to accept Donald Trump's offer. There is another mood, as you rightly mentioned. Russian officials see in Donald Trump, paradoxically, their last hope to somehow rationalize the behavior of their leaders. I'm talking now not about the supporters of the war. From the point of view of what's going on in Moscow, all Russian nomenclature, all Russian political establishment are supporters of the war because they are working in the system that is waging the war and is supporting Russian dictatorship. But we see this division between, let's say, the loud supporters of the war, for those who are praising Russian military achievements, are talking loudly about the future victory, are blaming the West on any occasion, and in really very bad words, offending the Western leader in a very undiplomatic expressions and statements. We see the other part of the nomenclature that is more silent, more quiet, and don't see this part of the nomenclature, doesn't see in the war the new normal. It is de facto the new normal Russian life, but still these people have hopes to return to some other norm, more rational, more peaceful, more global, maybe. Basically to return as much as possible, as far as possible, to return the pre-war condition. Of course, it's not possible, and people do understand it clearly. It's not possible in the same extent as it was before the invasion, but somehow what's going now, it's not normal. So there is some other more quiet, more peaceful norm of relations between Russia and the rest of the world and the West. This part of Russian officials may hope, and well, we have voices from this underground, that Donald Trump may be a person who can sober up Vladimir Putin, or at least, well, may stop this indefinite development of the conflict exactly because this is Donald Trump and not somebody else. Exactly because this particular person, this particular American politician may have some influence on Vladimir Putin that they themselves, the members of Russian political class, business community, have lost long ago.
Let's take a step back. And I think that for everything what you described, the precondition would be that the shooting stops in Ukraine. And President-elect Trump, was very articulate on campaign trail that that's his intention, that if he's elected, he would stop the war in 24 hours, he claimed. Of course, 24 hours is an exaggeration, but there is a sense that there will be a deliberate effort to stop at least the killing. We don't know what the President Trump's idea is about how he will do that. He only said that he will put a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin if he doesn't want to sit down and talk, and he would put a lot of pressure on President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, if he doesn't want to sit down and talk. And then he will put them at the table and find a way to make compromise and find a deal that would satisfy, to a way, both sides. Like there's a deal that they could live with. So my question to you is that we don't know what's really in Trump's brain on like what his game plan is, or whether this game plan exists at all for the time being. Various people in Trump universe, like the vice president, like J.D. Vance, outline a deal along the lines like we're going to have a ceasefire in Ukraine, along the current lines of conflict, more or less. We don't discuss what happens to Kursk region, but let's assume that Ukrainians will swap this territory or withdraw. It will be a de facto partition of Ukraine. Russia will remain in control of around 18% of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, Donbass, and the land bridge from Donbass to Crimea. And this ceasefire deal would also include a moratorium on NATO membership for Ukraine. But in exchange, Ukraine will get some form of security guarantees that Russia does not reinvade Ukraine. And Ukraine will be somehow anchored into the West without formal NATO membership. So that's the outline of the deal. We don't know whether Trump shares that. Is, in your view, this deal acceptable to Vladimir Putin? And what will be Vladimir Putin trying to achieve in this negotiation if it comes to that?
Well, what I see now, in at least what we are listening from the future American administration, is that, to my opinion, they somehow are exaggerating the intention, the will, the wish of Vladimir Putin to end the war. Their understanding is based on very clear points. One, the war didn't go as Vladimir Putin has planned it and as he desired the war to develop. So the blitzkrieg has failed. Instead of several days of victorious campaign without many losses, the losses that Russia hasn't suffered in no conflict after the Second World War. In the role of Russian big wars, it's maybe the smallest in terms of human losses, but still it's the biggest one after the Second World War.
One of the smallest for now, because it's still unfortunately ongoing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. This first point somehow does want to bring the whole affair to an end. Second point is that Russia is suffering with the sanctions. And the third point maybe is that they are so different from the previous administration with their absolutely, let's say, idealistic and wishful ideas of returning to Ukrainian borders of 1991, that Putin will seize the opportunity to take their offer because it's realistic, because it helps him to end the war that didn't go as he wished, and then because it may help him to lift some of sanctions, which is, to my opinion, right now, in this particular moment, it's exaggeratedly optimistic. It's too optimistic for the time being. My impression is that Vladimir Putin, and that is something that I was trying to say in the very beginning of our conversation, Vladimir Putin, and one of the risks of Trump's victory for Vladimir Putin right now is that Trump can really bring an offer to the table and can try to impose an offer to stop the hostilities, which Vladimir Putin, it's not obviously that he does want to end right now, because after many setbacks and losses and unexpected developments of the first and the second year of the war of 2022, with its major defeats, I would say, for Russian military, and the year that exposed the weakness of the Russian military, then the 2023, which was very balancing on the edge between, you remember how Russian military and Russian political leadership was really scared about Ukrainian counteroffensive. Then Prigozhin's mutiny. In 2024, finally, Putin may judge that Russia has adapted to the war, Russia has learned how to wage the war, and the military fortune is finally on Russia's side. And at this very moment that Russia and he himself as Russian leader have overcome the major difficulties of the initial period of the war, the American president is coming and saying, guys, let's stop here. Whatever you have, maybe a bit less because we have to exchange it with the Kursk square kilometers. And this is the end. But it's exactly the time when Vladimir Putin doesn't want to hit the end, because he sees right now the end somewhere much more farther than he and his troops are staying, slowly moving now. And if you follow what the Russian officials are saying, including Lavrov, Peskov, Volodin, who is less relevant in this case, Putin himself, of course, are saying latest weeks, they are repeating the phrase that was heard in the start of the war, that all goals of special military operation will be achieved.
So if I understand you correctly, when we say that all goals of the special military operation will be achieved, special military operation is the Russian code word for the war. It means denazification and demilitarization. So making sure that Ukraine cannot pose any threat to Russia, not invade Kursk, not launch missiles into Russian territory, nothing and is not part of NATO and not a part of NATO infrastructure. And denazification means de facto change of the regime into something to the Russians' liking, and where the rights of the Russian speakers, which is a pretext for the Kremlin to control Ukrainian domestic politics, identity politics, culture, and the nation-building process, is ensured, and that Kremlin is in charge. So if I hear you correctly, Putin has not abandoned this goal to basically turn Ukraine, or large parts of Ukraine, that would include Kyiv, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa, like large population centers, into something similar to Belarus, maybe. So this goal has not been abandoned. And it might become, with a degree, like not so dependent on Russia as Belarus, but definitely in his sphere of influence, not in the sphere of influence of the West. And he's ready to fight. With that, the security guarantees that Ukraine currently has, and which make Ukrainian leadership and society very unhappy and frustrated. The pipeline for training, weapons supply, sharing of intelligence, that's something that Putin wants to stop. And just cessation of hostilities and canceling NATO membership will not be sufficient for him. So he will continue to fight. And you're saying that he feels that time is on his side. He has momentum, he has leverage, and he can last in this war of attrition longer than Ukraine can. If I hear you correctly, and I think I agree with you, that means that Trump will be very unlikely to push him into a negotiated deal. And if so, what are the instruments that Trump can use to coerce him into this deal? Or you think that actually Trump might give Putin what he wants?
Your reading and what I was saying is correct. And just to make long thing short, is the Trump's team assumption that Putin will be happy or ready to stop on the front line and to start negotiations on this front line. And even he will be happy to receive the land on the eastern and southern side of the front line is too optimistic. It's exactly the moment when Vladimir Putin doesn't want to stop because, as you said, the time on his side, because in the war of attrition, Russian military industry, which is largely untouched and out of the reach of possible Ukrainian bombing missiles, can produce more than Ukrainian military industry, which has been constantly bombed by Russian aerospace forces. And then the Kursk, of course, the Kursk region is another argument not to stop because Putin is not ready to trade Russian territory. Officially, he's declaring that even some part of Ukraine he doesn't control, and the Russian military never controlled, as the Zaporizhia town is Russian territory. So what to say about Kursk? Somehow I see, for instance, and it's not only in Russian propaganda, we can see it in Europe, in political circles, in European political parties, in European parliaments, on European and even American streets. You see people who are blaming Zelensky for resisting too hard, not only to the Russian invasion, but to the very idea of concessions and negotiations. But imagine that he is saying now, yes, let's stop on this line and start the talks, and I'm ready for concessions. What we hear from the Kremlin as a response, we hear that the minimum maybe possible line of the peace deal includes the territories that Russian military has not yet seized. And this is the Russian precondition. Maybe, I don't know, the optimists are saying that this is just the initial position for the talks, which is always exaggerated, more advanced. People want more for bargaining, they eventually receive. But it doesn't sound this way. Right now, it sounds as the pretext to continue from the Russian side. So if Trump just offer a ceasefire on the front line as it is now, the peace deal that Russia is ready to negotiate includes the territories that are some hundreds of kilometers behind the current front line, including two major towns. One is Zaporizhia that Russia has never controlled, and before the war that was almost 1 million inhabitants, major industrial city, and then Kherson that Russia controlled in 2022 for a brief time. And it was a major, the only, by the way, regional capital that Russia has seized after the invasion of 2022. And the major Ukrainian city that Ukrainian military forces have been able to liberate. For provided these, the major cities, one of which was liberated, it was a major victory for Ukrainians. Another one is a major industrial center with the still important population. Maybe, I don't know the current numbers, maybe nobody knows them, but still it's a major Ukrainian city. Just to give them up with the people, with the population to Putin, just because he claims them, would be, I think, just impossible for Ukrainians as far as they have some, at least minimum strength to resist.
My last question to you, you mentioned the group in the Russian elite that hopes that Trump will be able to sober Putin up, that he has some tools to force Putin into recognizing reality, that Russia will never have the resources to control all of Ukraine or majority of Ukraine minus the western part. In your mind, does President Trump have those tools and what those tools could be? Or that's a total fantasy land since there is no easy way to dial up sanctions, Western warehouses in terms of weapons that can be provided to Ukraine are nearly empty. And like those tools are nice to have, but they're not there. Or are we missing something and those tools actually exist?
Well, paradoxically, as I put it in my latest text published on Carnegie Politika, the Trump's victory is somehow the Russian plan of victory. You know this phrase about Ukrainian plan of victory, Zelensky's plan of victory, sometimes criticized for unrealistic approach, sometimes praised for steadiness and boldness. But if you see and look under the angle of what Russia wanted to achieve, not just on the Ukrainian soil, but more generally, it's very openly said that the new world order better to Russia, what can be better for Russia than the American president, the American leader, the leader of still the only superpower? What else can you achieve for changing the world order is to see in the White House a president, a figure that can support your claims, that can listen to your grievances, and that can finally divide somehow, if not the world, at least the region, according to your hopes and grievances. As I said, paradoxically, the Trump's victory in the presidential election was the plan of victory, or the final stage of Russian plan of victory, both for party of the war and the party of sobering Vladimir Putin. For first, it was exactly in 2016, a figure that could and still can listen to what Russia is saying and what the Kremlin is saying, and to give much of this to Russian hands. For this more silent and less part of Russian establishment, less happy with the war and the current confrontation with the West, Trump's victory is a chance to have in the White House somebody who could please Vladimir Putin, who can give him something that he can accept, and to stop the current confrontation, which is going on the way of escalation, and we don't know where it may end. If it doesn't work, for both parts of the Russian establishment, we can say that their plans of victory will fail. And then we return to what we are now, to the battleground, and the outcomes, well, may be different. The war, the conflict without an end, if Ukraine still keep the possibility and the strength to resist in this war of attrition without a visible end. And then, as you put it, to annex as much territory as Russia can digest and take. And then after the potential collapse of Vladimir Zelensky power in Kyiv, to try to put their figure that make from Ukraine another version of Belarus, a light satellite state.
I think that this is very sobering, and I'm leaving this conversation more depressed that I started it, Alexander. I think that my takeaway is that people see Trump, like people in Russia or in the Kremlin see Trump as something that's beneficial. But most importantly is that Vladimir Putin has not abandoned his maximalist.
Yes, I didn't answer about the tools, and this is basically why I'm skeptical. There are some tools of, military character, but they are not game-changing. You mean the missiles that can hit Russian targets deeper inside Russian territory, which already is happening. And you see that President Biden has decided to take the decision on his own not to leave the White House as a president who didn't dare to give the Ukrainian this one of the last possibilities to resist and to maybe break the situation before he leaves, not to leave this decision to the next president. It's already happening. It's not yet the game-changing, only we see the very dangerous, let's say, response. It's still not decided whether it was intercontinental ballistic missile or mid-range ballistic missile, maybe mid-range ballistic missile, but still the response was from Russian side was clear that is the type of the weapon we are going to use to counter this decision. And then, of course, the Europeans at least can project the use of this weapon out of Ukrainian territories. Maybe the Kremlin, they are thinking that it may prevent them of going farther this way. Then economic tools, which are or would work much more effectively if the West in the United States could achieve a really global character of sanctions. It's not the case. And I don't know, I'm not an economist, I'm not an economic lawyer to judge how much the secondary sanctions are effective. Could they be that effective as to prevent any substantial trade with Russia? Now we don't see this effect. And then what President Trump was saying about repeating President Reagan's achievement of bringing down the oil prices, which will deprive Russia of the incomes and the means for the war. But the oil analysts, including our colleagues, are saying that it is not that easy, if achievable at all, in the current situation. So the tools are limited. And in the situation of the limited tools, it's absolutely a question of not to say Vladimir Putin's good will or Vladimir Putin's bad will to listen to Trump's offer.
To sum it up, I would say that I'm still leaving this conversation pretty depressed. You convinced me that no matter what President Trump's idea about ending this war is, he doesn't really have tools to compel Vladimir Putin to a deal that would be acceptable to Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin believes that time is on his side. He hasn't abandoned his maximalist goals. And the material reality suggests that for now, at least, time is indeed favoring Russia in this war of attrition. That's a pretty sobering outcome of this conversation. I would suggest that you follow Alexander Baunov. He is on Twitter, currently known as X. He is a prolific writer for Carnegie Politika, and I really suggest you to read his latest piece outlining the considerations in the Kremlin about Trump's upcoming presidency. Follow Carnegie Politika, and we would very much be grateful to you if you could subscribe to this podcast, like us on various platforms, and share this information. Thank you, and stay safe.